Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me for Reimagining Education, Conversations on Character and the Common Good. This series is part of the Virtues and Vocations initiative here at Duke University, which seeks to make character, purpose, and meaning central to education and pre-professional and professional education in particular. My name is Suzanne Shanahan, and I direct the Keenan Institute for Ethics here at Duke, the institutional home for this initiative and this series. Before we jump in with today's conversation partner, just two notes about logistics. First, there are several folks working behind the scenes, so should there be any technical difficulties, they will swiftly jump in to address them, so please, no panic. Second, after about 40 minutes of conversation, we will open it up to Q&A. Please submit your questions through the Q&A mechanism, and they will be passed on directly to me to pose to today's conversation partner. And with that, I am delighted to introduce Katy Milkman on the topic of how to change. Katy Milkman is the James G. Dinan Professor at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. She is host of Charles Schwab's popular behavioral economics podcast, Choiceology, and the former president of the International Society for Judgment and Decision-Making. She is the co-founder and co-director of the Behavioral Change for Good initiative, a research center with the mission of advancing the science of lasting behavior change, whose work is being chronicled by Freakonomics Radio. She has a BA from Princeton, where she studied operations research, American studies, and her PhD is from Harvard, where she studied computer science and business. Her best-selling book, How to Change: The Science of Getting from Where You Are to Where You Want to Be, was released earlier this year. In this groundbreaking book, Milkman reveals a proven path that can take you from where you are to where you want to be, with a foreword by the psychologist Angela Duckworth, best-selling author of Grit. I would note that the foreword by Duckworth is one of the most lovely tributes to a human being I've read, referring to Katy as a superhuman. The book runs through a series of case studies and engaging stories where you'll learn why timing can be everything when it comes to making a change, how to turn temptation and inertia into assets, that giving advice, even if it's about something you are struggling with, can help you achieve more, whether you're a manager, coach, or teacher aiming to help others for the change or things you're struggling to get a kickstart with. How to Change offers an invaluable science-based blueprint for achieving your goals once and for all. I'd also note that the Behavior Change for Good initiative is launching their own virtual event series later this week. Authors at BCFG will feature interviews with BFCG team scientists who have written new books aimed at popular audiences. Registration is available in the chat box below. Welcome, Katy.
Thank you. Thanks for the lovely introduction and for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So in today's conversation, we want to do three different things. First, explore, reflect, and then consider. I want to explore your work in How to Change, both where it came from and what the key findings are. Then I'd love to reflect on this crazy year we've had. I know you've done a lot of work on vaccinations, so would love to hear about some of those studies. And then third, we'd love to reflect on how your work might provide insight to educators. So that's how we're going to begin. So let's start by exploring your work. But I did want to start with a bit of a disclaimer. I confess, I tend to feel really strongly both ways about this sort of work that professes to provide a way to tackle those challenges, those ways of being that we'd all like to change. That is, I tend to be super skeptical. Yet at the same time, I'm a person who loves New Year's. I even loved every Monday morning as an opportunity for weekly renewal. I'm also the mother of fraternal 17-year-old twins, one of whom is disconcertingly organized. The other is frightfully disorganized. One has a most extraordinary compulsion to routine and consistency. The other, quite the opposite. My organized daughter is the kind of person who leaves her own birthday party to get to sleep. The disorganized daughter routinely doesn't come home from school with both shoes. When the organized teen asks why she's leaving her own party, she says because it's time to go to bed. When the disorganized teen comes home without a shoe, she says, if I knew where it was, I'd be wearing it. So as a parent, I am both very eager to encourage my super organized teen to let it go a little bit, and my super disorganized teen to get her act together a little bit. So for me, your book is just a wonder. I love how it's organized in this incredibly thoughtful, direct way, providing concrete examples. And better yet, as a parent of teens who are only going to read so much that I give them, the end of chapter summaries are genius. So thank you for that. But let's first jump in, and just if you could tell me your academic personal path to this particular work. How did you end up here as someone who started at Princeton in American Studies, doing something rather different?
Yeah, actually, American Studies was a minor. I was an engineer, so it was even more radical of a shift in some ways. Just thinking about, optimization of systems, design, and supply chains, to studying behavior change turned out to be kind of a giant pivot in my life. And by the way, I love the stories about your fraternal twins. That's fascinating, and I am resisting the temptation to change this conversation and interview you about them and their behavior patterns. But I'm really glad you found this work helpful to them. My path was a long and winding one, and it's not one that I would recommend to anyone when I talk to undergraduates thinking about career choices. Mostly, if I end up describing my own path, I describe it as an example of how hard it is to really know what you want to do when you're 18 years old, and how hard it is to draw a straight line from there to where you want to be. That we have to do a lot of meandering and exploration in order to figure out what's right for us. And I ended up sort of lucking into a PhD program that wasn't the right fit, but that was flexible enough that when I found what I was passionate about, I was able to pursue it. So I went straight from undergraduate to a PhD program in computer science and business. I thought the internet was really interesting and was going to change the way everything happened. I was sort of still interested in things like supply chains, but a little bit consumer decision making. And I liked research a lot. I had a great experience doing research as an undergraduate. So I knew I wanted to get a PhD. It turned out I just was wrong about what I wanted to study. And it was when I was a first year PhD student at Harvard, which was a sort of hotbed for behavioral science and behavioral economics in particular, I was required to take a microeconomics graduate sequence, and I was introduced to behavioral economics. So I learned about, prospect theory, loss aversion, work by Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky that really revolutionized all of economics, but introduced the idea that people are predictably mistaken in the judgments that we make. We make predictable errors. Another idea introduced is the idea that we are present biased, that we focus too much on the pleasures of the here and now and not enough on our long-term outcomes, like saving enough for retirement and our good health. And those things just resonated with me and captured my attention much more than the work I thought I wanted to do on computer science and business. So I was lucky to be able to pivot and start studying judgment and decision making. And that's what I study now. But initially, I was just curious really about all the weird ways that people make mistakes. And I thought the idea to start fixing some of them sounded really appealing. And I was doing, I would say, casual work on that. It looked a bit like what I'd call me-search. So research that was relevant to my own life and the lives of my friends and family, and felt practically useful, which I'd always been drawn to. But it actually wasn't until I was an assistant professor at Wharton that I really fell in love with the idea of doing work that's focused on how to change, which is the topic of my book and the focus of the research center I co-direct with Angela Duckworth, the Behavior Change for Good initiative. And the big moment of realization for me was actually at a seminar, not that unlike this one, although it was a research seminar rather than sort of a conversation. And a scholar at the medical school was presenting. I would wander over there for research presentations often because we had a really strong group studying behavioral economics and health. And I was intrigued by what they were up to. And someone put up a graph showing a breakdown of the causes of premature death in the US. And what really blew my mind is that the largest fraction of premature deaths in the US are, of all the causes, from accidents to genetics to the environment, the biggest wedge was behaviors we could change. 40% of premature deaths are due to decisions we make about what to eat and drink, whether or not to move our bodies, whether or not to smoke, whether or not to practice safe behaviors when we're in vehicles. I thought those things probably mattered, but I had no idea how much they added up until I saw that graph. And that completely changed the course of my work and really led me, frankly, to write this book eventually and to co-found this research center with Angela on behavior change, because I realized if things accumulated this much in the domain of health, surely they did in other important life domains too. And so think about savings outcomes and financial wellness, think about educational outcomes. And if we could really put all of our attention to that problem and make a dent in it, it felt like there was so much more good that could be done than I had realized before. So I sort of stopped doing other kinds of research that had intrigued me on the side and became much more single-mindedly focused. And again, that's what led me eventually to write the book. I felt like I had enough accumulated knowledge that maybe I could be helpful.
So where did you start? Once you had this realization of this 40% that were deaths that were premature that could be avoided. So how did you actually pivot from the kind of work you were doing and jump in? What was the first study? What was the first foray?
I wouldn't say that it was, I had been doing work that was related to this already. It's just that I had been doing other work too, right? So to give you an example, I'd done research on how to encourage vaccination in 2009 when there was a swine flu pandemic. We didn't, anyway, it pales in comparison to what we're going through now, but it was very scary at the time. And there was a combined flu shot that you could get that had both swine flu and the regular flu bundled into a single vaccine. And it was clear that vaccine uptake wasn't going to be as high as would be ideal, because it never was at that point in the United States. In fact, in 2009, it wasn't even recommended by the CDC that everyone get a flu shot. So things have changed a lot, and you couldn't get one in a pharmacy. So we've had a lot of improvements since 2009, but back then only about 30% of the populations encouraged to get these kinds of vaccines was often getting them. And so I partnered with a large organization to nudge flu vaccinations. And we saw at zero cost, big results. We increased flu vaccination by about 4 percentage points with a small change to a reminder mailing that just prompted people to write down where will you get your vaccine, when will, at what time will you get it, how will you get there, those kinds of questions. In our specific study, we were using this insight from Peter Gollwitzer on the power of implementation intentions, or getting people to form a more concrete if-then plan. So I'd already done work like that, and I was really excited about it. But it was at this moment that I really pivoted and said, okay, I want to focus all of my attention on that kind of work. I'm not going to, I'd done research on like what kinds of news stories go viral on the New York Times, which was a really fun project. And I really, I learned a lot from that, but I realized it wasn't advancing this kind of goal. So it just changed the way I chose projects, and eventually led Angela and I to co-found this research center, which of course has really increased the capacity, I think, to do good by building a collective of about 150 scientists around the world, all of whom do behavior change research. We come together at conferences. We have opportunities where we run big research studies together, and that has all really supercharged this agenda. But initially, it was just sort of selection of projects changed.
Great. Can you talk a little bit and sort of walk us through the kind of core areas that you outline in the book to give some folks some sense of the kind of key findings you're drawing, but also the interesting experiments that are driving those findings? Because I think you bring to bear an extraordinary array of evidence, but also great stories and ways of thinking of this work. And could you also, right, you talk about confidence, you talk about timing, you talk about advice. What piece of the book for you is most exciting and robust, and maybe you're proud of, if you will?
Oh, Matt, those are tough questions. Okay, well, I can start by talking a little bit about the organization of the book and sort of the key ideas that I'm trying to get across. And I should say the key message of the book is that I think it's really important to try to diagnose what's standing in the way of behavior change before proposing a solution. And it's something I've seen a lot when I work with organizations, with MBA students, with individuals who want to change, when I'm just talking to them about how they're going about it. All of these groups are very likely to look for sort of shiny solutions that they've heard work, like, oh, we should set big audacious goals, or, visualizing success must be really important, or social norms, make sure everybody knows that most people are doing it. That's really important. And those aren't bad ideas. All of those things, there's some research that supports them. But what I've seen is often a failure to match the solution to the problem. And if you understand what's standing in your way and you use a science-based solution to that particular problem, it's easier to get a lot farther. So if the challenge, say, with getting to the gym every day is you keep forgetting, that's a really different barrier that might benefit from something like reminders or scheduling, than if you don't go to the gym on a regular basis because it's miserable and you absolutely hate the experience when you're there. And then you need to figure out a way to make your workouts less dreaded and feel like less of a chore so that you have a better experience in the moment. So depending on what the barrier is, we use really different solutions. So I organized the book around the common barriers, internal, I should say, to change. My work is on internal barriers, not external, even though obviously those are huge and really important and involve, problems as serious as inequality. And, I don't go there because that's not my expertise, but we obviously need tons of work and help on those dimensions as well. But I'm focused on internal barriers. So the key barriers that I focus on in the book include the problem of getting started. And you asked what's some of the research I'm most proud of and most excited about. And I'll mention the work I've done on moments when we're particularly motivated to begin, or fresh starts, with my colleague and former student Heng-Chen Dai of UCLA and Jason Reese, who's a Wharton Senior Fellow. Really proud of the work we did, identifying that these moments in our lives that feel like new beginnings, from, as you mentioned, the start of a new week or month to New Year's to our birthdays, even, the celebration of small holidays that feel like fresh start moments to us, or start of spring, can springboard us into change and can be used actually as nudges if we point them out on calendars to people to promote change. So that's where I begin. And then the book goes on to other challenges that can be overcome in different ways, from the challenge of impulsivity, that, it's often not fun in the moment to do what's good for us in the long run, and we overweight the present when making our choices, to procrastination, which is sort of the flip side of impulsivity, to the forgetting problem, which can be solved. Actually, I just mentioned some of the work I had done in 2009 around nudging people to get vaccinated. And one of the reasons that asking people, when exactly, what's the date and time when you're going to get this vaccine, and in this location, and figuring out those details turns out in a reminder to be really critical to ensuring people don't forget and that they follow through. So from forgetfulness, I also talk about the challenge of laziness, which most people think of as a really negative word, but I actually think of as not so much a bug as a probably good feature in general of human nature, that we take the path of least resistance, that we look for shortcuts, just like a good algorithm would. That's the computer scientist in me loving that feature, but it creates challenge when behavior change isn't the path of least resistance. So I talk about defaults and habits and how we can use those to turn things around. And then there's a chapter on confidence and the importance of believing you can make a change in order to actually succeed. And finally, well, not quite last, but almost last, is the topic of social. So, is our social network set up to support change? Have we surrounded ourselves with the right individuals? And the very last thing, which is almost like an epilogue, is just focusing how to create change that endures. So that's not so much an obstacle to change as a necessary part of any change journey. So I organize the book around those challenges, and then present the best science I'm aware of, done often by others, sometimes by me, that helps tackle those problems specifically.
So what role does desire to change play? So when you start with that statistic of 40% of kind of premature deaths are preventable, is it your sense that those 40% of individuals, certainly we would hope they would prefer to prevent their own premature death, but on a daily basis, things like going to the gym, sort of getting your work done in a timely fashion or doing a good job, how much of that is desire? And is that an a priori assumption of this kind of work, that you need to have that initial impulse?
Yeah, it's a great question. I absolutely wrote my book and do a lot of my research, though not all, with a focus on people who would like to achieve these goals, that their motive is already there. And then the question is just, how do I get from where I am to where I want to be? It's a whole other question. How do you convince someone to make a change if they're not interested in making a change? I think there's some overlapping tools that can be useful. In particular, I think actually social influence, which is a tool you can harness when you want to change to help you actually follow through. It's also a tool that can change your mind. And I think Robert Cialdini of Arizona State University, sort of the great author of the book Influence and thinker of big thoughts about how we can persuade people to change their behavior, and brilliant scientist, I think he has a lot more to say, and I recommend his book to anyone who's interested in how do I motivate someone to want to change. And I'm trying to come along once someone is motivated, or an organization is eager to motivate change, and say, okay, here are the tools, given that you have a receptive audience, or given that you want to change, here are the tools you can use to help give yourself the best chance. Which, by the way, I want to say you opened by saying you're generally skeptical of this kind of work. And I just want to actually echo that and say, me too. I think most of it's oversold. And I tried hard. I don't know if I succeeded in this book to point out that change is very difficult, that most attempts at change fail before they succeed, and many never succeed. But that doesn't mean there's no use in trying. Some do succeed, and there's a lot of science that can give us a better chance of succeeding. And that's what I'm trying to lay out in the book.
And I think that's what I really appreciated in the book, was this idea of you're not going from 0 to 100, but you can get closer to your goals with different strategies. I also, as you described, really appreciated this notion that there are different barriers to change, and having the approach that best suits your particular barrier is very important. So it's not this kind of generic one size fits all, 3 steps to greatness, which I think is a really super approach. Have you encountered challenges to change that you have yet to find strategies to address? Are there individual, not really putting aside, as you said, the structural issues, but individual problems that are trickier, thornier, harder to get traction on?
Yeah, well, setting aside convincing someone that they need to change, which I think can be thorny and tricky, once we're in the realm of people who are motivated to make a change, one category I really don't address in my book or in my research is addiction. And, for obvious reasons, there's a huge difference between that kind of change and the kinds of change that I focus on in my research. And I feel like, things are known, but there's a lot left to understand about how to make that very difficult kind of change happen. Another category of change or category of barrier, I'll say that I would love to see more work done and hope to study more myself, and that I touch on in the book, but I really feel like we need to know a lot more than we do, is how to recover from setbacks, which are inevitable. And as I've already mentioned, I think the fresh start effect, or the fact that we're more motivated at new beginnings, can be sort of viewed as one of the solutions to that, okay, you had a setback, but look for the next Monday or the next moment that you're going to feel like fresh and new and you can try again. There's some wonderful research by my colleague, Marissa Sharif at the Wharton School, and Suzanne Chu of Cornell, showing that we can create what they call emergency reserves, or basically recognize that there will be stumbles and actually give ourselves a few get out of jail free cards so that we won't give up after those stumbles, but rather see a way to staying on track and feeling that we haven't completely lost out. There's also great work by Carol Dweck on mindset and how important it is to have a growth mindset, so that you can think about failure not as diagnostic of you as a person, but as a part of your journey to grow and learn. So there are studies and there is research that helps us think about how do we recover in the face of a stumble or a failure. But I think it's the biggest barrier to change, perhaps. And I don't even have a chapter on it in the book because I sort of touch on it in lots of other places. It's almost so common that I know it's part of every journey. And I think it would be ideal if we knew even more than we do already about tools that can help people pick up the pieces, feel confident in themselves again, and know how to push through it and learn, frankly, from whatever went wrong the first time. Because often that also doesn't happen. There isn't necessarily an new understanding of how to do better. There can just be demotivation.
Great. One of the things I really appreciated in the book was the section on advice, and then you had a May piece just recently about advice. Can you talk a little bit about the argument you're making there?
Yeah, and I should say this is based on research by the brilliant Lauren Eskris-Winkler, who is a new professor at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. She was Angela Duckworth's PhD student at Penn. I got to work with her as a postdoc, and she did this really, I think, incredibly creative dissertation work that led her to have the insight that we get advice giving wrong a lot of the time in life. So she was interviewing people who were struggling to achieve goals as part of her dissertation work, ranging from students to salespeople, and interviewing them about, what might motivate them more, what might help them achieve more. And what she was really struck by is how many of them had great insights that they just weren't sort of dredging up and putting to use naturally about how to change their own behavior when she started talking to them about it. And also that confidence and motivation were often low naturally. And she wondered if the traditional way that we tried to help and encourage people who were struggling to achieve a goal might be wrong. And by traditional way, she was specifically interested in the fact that most of the time when we encounter someone who we see as struggling and they start telling us about what's going on, or we learn what's going on, our first instinct is to just give them advice on what we think they should do differently, whether it's solicited or not. And she was particularly worried about unsolicited advice and how demotivating that might be to people who maybe, they've been struggling for a long time. You've heard about their challenges for a minute, and you come along and say, I think you should be doing these 7 things. And it can make them feel like you must think they're such a loser. How could they not have even thought of that? And she wondered if we should actually flip that traditional formula, and instead of giving advice, put people in the position of advice giver to someone else. Ask them what they think people who are similar to them, their peers, might want to do in order to create change or to achieve the goals they've been struggling to achieve. She thought this would be helpful for a few reasons. One is that it would be motivating and encouraging for someone to tell you, I'm going to put you in the, on a pedestal as a role model. So just as giving advice suggests, hey, I think you have very little knowledge and wisdom and you don't have what it takes to make a change. Putting you in the position of advice giver does the opposite, says, I think you are really smart and creative and you can do this. She also thought it would be useful to ask people to give advice because they might come up with insights they wouldn't have otherwise when they have to give it to someone else. And finally, once you've given that advice to someone, you're going to feel hypocritical if you don't actually walk the walk yourself. So she has run lots of experiments. I've gotten to be involved in one of them, showing that this actually is a really valuable way to help people change, putting them in the position of advice giver to someone else who's trying to achieve the same goal helps the advice giver do better in that domain. So my favorite study is one we ran together with about 2,000 high school students, some of whom were randomly assigned at the beginning of the third term of the academic year, or excuse me, the third quarter of the academic year, to give about 10 minutes of advice to peers in a digital format. So they're filling out a survey in a computer lab, and they're told, we want some advice from you on how your younger peers can study more effectively and do better in school this quarter. And they answered 14 different questions, some open-ended, some multiple choice. And we said, we're going to share this advice, and we did with younger students. So half of the students in our experiment got that treatment, that advice giving experience, and the other half were in a control condition. So life went on as usual. And then we measured everyone's performance in the third quarter, their grades in two dimensions we said we would look at in advance. We sort of pre-specified these as our core outcomes, their grades in math and their grades in the class they had told us at the start of the program they most wanted to improve in. And what we found is significant improvements in both of those dimensions for those who did this advice giving tasks relative to the control group. So small changes, about 1 point on a GPA that's ranging from 50 to 100. So we're not turning C+ students right into valedictorians, but meaningful, right, and statistically significant. And you could imagine that if you did something more than a 10-minute intervention and gave people the opportunity to mentor and coach others, that might grow. So I think that's a really underutilized insight, and it's one of my favorite studies that we cover and ideas covered in the book.
Yeah, I really loved that study, and I wondered, have you tried or are you anticipating trying the kind of sort of more intensive interventions like that to see if they do that over a period of time or do mentoring, that it does have a reinforcing or amplifying effect that you've already seen?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's actually something that Angela and I are talking about a lot, sort of how to do those kinds of interventions. It's a little more difficult to implement, as you might imagine, but I am very excited about the potential for them. And I will say that there have been some studies that I now interpret with this lens that that weren't necessarily intended to isolate the effect of advice giving, but have shown that mentoring can benefit the mentor. And I was recently told about a new study where I think it was assistant professors mentored on teaching more junior assistant professors, and there was a random assignment component, and the researchers intended to study the effects on the mentees, but then found, there were actually really big effects on the mentors, which hadn't been expected. So some people are discovering this, even though that's not what they set out to find. But I think, I'm really interested in building on this work and seeing if we can develop ways to make it particularly useful and light touch, which is, easy to scale and high value.
Great. I want to pivot now a little bit to the past 20 months or so, which worldwide has been unusual, extraordinary, challenging in so many ways. I'd love you to talk a little bit about how you've reflected on this and how it's influenced your current work.
Yeah, it's been hard in so many ways for so many people, and it's sort of unimaginable to me that it's been 20 months, but it has. The biggest change that I made in my life was, some of the biggest changes had to do with, I have a 5-year-old at home who went to pre-kindergarten on Zoom school, and that was its own challenge. And I have an amazing, supportive academic spouse who really stepped up. So I should say that too. But in my research, the biggest change was to try to help with understanding how we could encourage vaccination. And actually, the team that Angela and I oversee at the Behavior Change for Good initiative pivoted towards doing this work in the spring of 2020, before anyone else was really thinking about vaccination challenges. We had done some work on flu vaccines already, and knew from that work, and I mentioned it earlier, that this was not going to be just a challenge of developing a vaccine and then scaling up distribution. We knew there was a third variable that needed to be focused on, which was ensuring that people wanted to take the vaccine, and that we knew how to communicate about it effectively so that this life-saving vaccine would actually save lives. We wrote an op-ed actually in USA Today in June of 2020 and said, like, this is the missing thing no one is focusing on, needs to be focused on. And we sort of threw all of our resources at that problem. We built 2 massive experiments, we call them mega studies, where we ran a tournament essentially with all of the 150 scientists on our team and asked them, what messages do you think would be most effective to encourage vaccination, sort of go? And we did this in 2 contexts. One context was in partnership with Penn Medicine and Geisinger Health, which are 2 local health systems that cumulatively serve really large population in the sort of Pennsylvania Northeast area. And the other was with Walmart, which is obviously even bigger, and their pharmacy chain. And we developed messages. We got 75 ideas from team members at the Behavior Change for Good initiative. We have interdisciplinary collaboration, so economists, psychologists, sociologists, doctors, lawyers, computer scientists, all coming up with their best ideas that might work. And we did 2 massive experiments of text messages to encourage vaccination. And we wanted to develop and test ideas on real vaccine decisions in the fall of 2020. So the insights would be ready basically the minute vaccine approval came through for COVID. So we did everything, all of our testing was done with flu vaccines, but all of the messages were designed to be portable. And we tested dozens of messages in both settings and have published papers about what the best performers were. Really interestingly, the same basic formula rose to the top in both settings, both where we were nudging people to go get a vaccine at their pharmacy and where we were contacting them 3 days before they had a healthy visit with a primary care provider and would be offered a vaccine that they could accept or decline. So pretty different settings for making a decision about vaccination. One, you have to decide to go get in your car, drive, ask your pharmacist for it. The other, you have to accept it when it's offered to you. And we see the same thing. And that is that language that basically said, we have reserved a vaccine for you, or a vaccine is waiting for you, rose to the top. Multiple messages were also more effective than a single message when we were trying to nudge vaccination in a pharmacy setting, probably because those multiple reminders are extra opportunities to actually capture someone's attention and get them into action. And interestingly, or I would say, really exciting result of this work is a couple of team scientists, including my former student Heng-Chen Dai and Sylvia Sicardo, who's at Carnegie Mellon. They took the best performing message from these 2 trials that we did with flu vaccines, turned around, got UCLA medical systems to use them to nudge COVID-19 vaccinations in an experiment run at the beginning of this year, and found that, again, it was effective and outperformed other messages to say, to emphasize this ownership, this sense of ownership, this belongs to you, come claim your vaccine. So we think that is, really valuable work. We're really proud that we did it. Hopefully, I think at this point in the pandemic, those kinds of light touch messages that can convey, a sense of ownership and the sense of this is recommended by your doctor or pharmacist, otherwise why have they reserved it for you, and sort of hassle-free. I think this may be helpful for booster shots and also for encouraging people in countries that aren't as far along in terms of vaccination. I don't think this is going to convince the people who are really vaccine resistant at this stage in the pandemic in the United States, but we're still really pleased that we could help in the ways that we were able to earlier in the game, and hopefully also, as I said, with boosters, with kids under 11, I have one, who are hopefully going to be able to get vaccines around Halloween. And I'll just mention really briefly, one other thing, we partnered with the city of Philadelphia on a vaccine sweepstakes to test in an experimental way what was being rolled out. Actually, at that point, we didn't, when we proposed it and started organizing it, no one was doing this, but we ended up a few weeks after Ohio announced their vaccine sweepstakes, launching ours. And ours was designed with an experimental component so that we could do a tight evaluation and actually put bounds on its impact. Specifically, we randomly selected some zip codes in the city of Philadelphia for vast priority in terms of their likelihood of winning up to $50,000 prizes if we called and found out you had got, could confirm that the person we called had gotten a vaccine when we drew winners. And what we were able to do actually is show that that was not very effective. The very early results sort of looked a bit encouraging. It may have mattered a tiny bit in June, right when we announced it, but overall, we did this pre-registered experiment. We can put pretty tight bounds and say, didn't increase vaccination by, our point estimate is at all. And we can rule out effects of more than increasing vaccination by more than 10%, which is really important because everyone, I think, was really excited about those kinds of techniques. And this pointed, made us more pessimistic about them and pointed more towards using tools like mandates at this stage in the game, which of course has been a policy that's starting to be embraced. So that's the work we really did on this, and I hope it's helped.
So wow, that's just fantastic and interesting about this sort of lottery sweepstakes model. Why do you think the kind of light touch message that said a vaccine is waiting for you was so effective? What was that cueing or enabling or prompting in individuals?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a few things, though our study doesn't allow us to disentangle this, but based on past research, we think that it was effective likely because when you feel like something belongs to you, we tend to value it more. So this is a phenomenon called the endowment effect that Richard Thaler and Danny Kahneman have studied, both Nobel laureates. And I think actually the Nobel Prize Committee cited the work on the endowment effect when Richard Thaler won the prize in 2017. So saying, yours or it's reserved for you may cue that, oh, it's mine, I don't want someone else to have it, and I value it more. It may also convey that there's going to be less hassle if I think it's reserved for me, that this isn't going to be a problem. So that might be important. People care a lot about hassle factors. It conveys that it's recommended by whoever's sending the message, or else why would they have reserved it for you, which again may matter. And so we think those are probably the key reasons that this is effective, but that wasn't what our research was really designed to disentangle. It was just testing lots of different techniques, from sending you a joke about the flu to telling you most people are doing it, or numbers are on the rise, you should get one too, to emphasizing the importance of doing this to protect other people. We tested lots and lots of different tactics, and this is what rose to the top. So really, we were just running a horse race to figure out, okay, what should we recommend be deployed more widely based on our results, as opposed to what's driving them.
Great, super, super helpful. Before we just open up for questions, as educators, both with undergraduates and professional and graduate students, and are there insights from your work that you think are particularly relevant for educators in thinking about engaging with students at all levels?
Yeah, I think one of the insights, and I don't know if I can claim this is exclusively from my work, I'd say from research on behavior change in general, although I've studied this to some degree. I think we underappreciate how important the experience in the moment is for follow through. So in general, because we're so present biased, we focus much more attention on whether we're enjoying a specific activity right now than on the long-term benefits it has, but we tend to underappreciate this. So if studying feels painful, if exercising is no fun, we're very unlikely to persist. And there's great research actually by Caitlin Woolley of Cornell University and Eilert Fischbach of the University of Chicago, showing that most people think if they have some big goal in the domain of education or elsewhere, the best way to achieve it is just look for the most efficient, effective path. But some people look for a more fun way to pursue it, and those are the people who persist. And if we nudge people to do things in a way that's more fun, they keep coming back to it over and over again. And they have this wonderful study that I love showing kids who were in a math class and asked to do math worksheets. Some of them were randomly assigned to what they sort of called a fun condition, where there were snacks available and music playing in the background and markers made available to those students. And there's reason to be skeptical that this is going to be distracting and lead to less persistence, but kids in that group end up persisting longer on their math worksheets. And I've done research on how important it is to make it fun to pursue your goals by linking them. I call it temptation bundling, linking chores with treats. So you could think of doing that with a study habit with, you're only allowed to pick up your favorite caffeinated beverage that maybe has some unhealthy added ingredients that make it extra tasty when you're on the way to hit the books. Or I have a favorite example. Someone was telling me they only let themselves burn their favorite scented candles while working on their dissertation. So there's different ways that you can try to make the experience more fun of studying. And I think as educators, we underappreciate how important that enjoyment component is. We think, if the long-term goal is important enough to people, they will just push through, just do it, as Nike would say. But it's so important for that moment-to-moment experience to be engaging and enjoyable. I think we undervalue that. And it's something I was talking with Steve Levitt of UChicago about recently. Like, I loved his book Freakonomics so much, in part because I think what it did was it, took a tool set that is typically applied to problems that, we don't wake up in the middle of the night thinking about, like how to increase labor force participation. Actually, some people do, and we probably should wake up, but it might not be like what you want to talk about at cocktail parties. And he applied it to questions that you do want to talk about at cocktail parties, right? Like, when do sumo wrestlers cheat, for example? I think if we spent more time thinking about, the kinds of questions we have our students working on, the types of assignments we do, if you're going to have them run regressions on data, does it need to be data about oil prices, or could it be data about, blockbuster movies? What are the things they're intrinsically interested in? And can you structure the work so that it's more closely related and tied to those things? They can still learn the same principles, but they're having more fun and more intrinsically interested in the moment because of the choices we make as educators.
That's great. That's really fantastic to kind of bring the fun back in. So super. So I'm going to turn to audience questions now, if that's okay. And we have the first. The journal Nature Communications has a research article titled Early Career Setback and Future Career Impact. Its opening sentence is, setbacks are an integral part of a scientific career, yet little is known about their long-term effects. It concluded that failures in the first phase of a career may mean one can come back stronger than those who have never stumbled. Do you agree?
Yeah, that's a really interesting, I think I have actually seen that paper, that I don't remember all the details of the methodology. It certainly matches my intuition about how important it is to be able to recover from setbacks and to recognize that those are a part of life and to try to plan for them, as opposed to expecting things to be rosy. If you know the research on the planning fallacy, which I think is some of the most important research that's been done in the behavioral decision research arena, which is my field, what it tells us is that we tend to be overconfident about how long it will take us to achieve, we're overconfident about how long, meaning we think it'll be short. So to achieve big goals. And actually a lot of this work is done in educational contexts, like students estimating how long it will take them to write a final paper, a senior thesis. Their estimates are way off. They're much too optimistic. And we don't tend to think about all the things that'll go wrong. We just imagine a path to success. And that's part of what leads to the planning fallacy. Once we start encountering failures and setbacks, I suspect more likely to plan for them in the future. And that might be really critical to success in a lot of walks of life. Certainly being more realistic is important to so many things. And there's a great book written by my friend and colleague, Don Moore, who's a professor at UC Berkeley's Haas School, called Perfectly Confident. It's all about the importance of calibrating your confidence. You don't want to be too overconfident or underconfident, and how do you sort of achieve that right balance? So it certainly makes sense that having early experiences with failure would help you plan better and maybe be more resilient. But obviously, it can also crush confidence and lead you to leave a field. So I don't think we should be necessarily overexposing people to failure based on that finding. I think we have to figure out ways to help people learn how to deal with setbacks that aren't so demoralizing that they cause them to leave whatever it is they're trying to do. Unless, of course, it's right for them to exit, which I should say, sometimes exit from a career path is the right path. But if the goal, for instance, one thing I care a lot about in academia is cultivating more women and minorities staying in this career path. And those are groups that traditionally face more setbacks and may have lower confidence based on all the extra negative stereotypes they face and have faced throughout their lives and so on. I would be nervous about trying to actually expose them to early failures in order to get them to stay, because it could backfire and get them to leave. So anyway, I think it's complicated, but that research is really interesting.
Great, thank you. Next up, I'm interested in learning more about your research regarding the multiple reminders approach to vaccinations. Is there any research showing how encountering multiple reminders causes anxiety and stress for those who are interested in getting the vaccine but haven't gotten around to doing so?
That's an interesting question. I don't know of research on how reminders can add to stress for those who don't follow through, but at some level, I think that's sort of the mechanism, right? Is that if you haven't done something and it dropped off of your mind, and then you keep getting nagged about it, it's going to come back to the top of mind. It might be a little bit stressful and you'll feel, oh my gosh, I'd better do this. So to some degree, I think that might be the point rather than a negative consequence. There's really great work by Erez Yoeli and Dave Rand at MIT and collaborators that looked at, in a developing country context, reminders to adhere to a tuberculosis treatment regimen, and showed that basically repeated reminders, I'll call it nagging, have these huge benefits in terms of long-term outcomes for patients, because compliance with the regimens was raised so much by sending these sort of aggressive, like, first I send you a text, then I tell you you're going to phone call. If you don't respond to the second text, then I do call you. And I think, as moms, we're both moms, right? We know it's not always met with delight when you nag other people, but it often is effective. And when there are really important problems like health challenges that we need to get to the other side of, I think it's probably an underused strategy, maybe because it has negative connotations. But if it can save lives, my view is I'm okay with it adding, maybe possibly irritating people a little bit or adding a bit of stress, so long as it's not, catastrophic, which I don't think there's any evidence that it would be.
So just following up on that a little bit, right? As a mom of teenage girls, the nagging effect, sometimes I wonder if it creates a resistance to doing it at all, right? Sort of if you feel nagged, then you're going to resist that. Is there any evidence of that, or is that just my household experience?
There's more evidence of reactance, which is the psychological name for that kind of backfiring effect. When you feel like the person who is nagging or pressuring you is making a coercive attempt to change your behavior, and it's not a trusted source, which, I know parents are trusted, but it's yeah, we have a somewhat adversarial relationship with our kids to some degree. I think we might fit into the category of untrusted in that sort of traditional messenger setting, and that they're just sick of hearing from us. They think we may have different motives than they do. We don't understand them, and so on. So I think it fits into that category. But yes, there is some evidence of reactance, and I think one of the most important things we've learned in some of the work that's been done on vaccine hesitancy is how important the messenger is for driving reactance. So there's research by Rob Willer at Stanford, and also actually MIT's Dave Rand, who was involved in the nagging study I just mentioned, that suggests when you get a reminder and encouragement to get a vaccine from a political party leader who is aligned with your party, it's encouraging and effective. When you hear from someone who's in the other party, it generates reactance. So I think it's important to be aware of who the messenger is if we are worried about nagging generating bad reactions. It needs to be a trusted source. And, I think we could overdo it. Our studies, we tested 2 messages or 3 messages from a pharmacy. We weren't testing 20. That's a really different category. And I don't know what would happen if you got into that domain, but we didn't see any backfiring with multiple messages in our study. We saw that it enhanced efficacy.
So just as a parent, I find having siblings share the message often works better than coming from the parent. So
that's really interesting. Yeah. So it's again, who's the messenger? Are they someone you identify more with and relate to more? These things are so important in persuasion.
yep. Okay, next question. Your work with Angela Duckworth, who focuses on character strengths. How does your research apply to matters of character? Becoming more honest or empathetic, which are perhaps harder to measure than changes like exercising or saving more money?
Yeah, it's a great question. I tend to be, so my training leads me to be sort of obsessed with things that I can objectively measure. So I tend to study outcomes like, how much exercise, how many times did somebody go to the gym, or, did they get their vaccine, or how much did their retirement savings increase, or how did their grades change, rather than measuring character, which you necessarily have to rely on survey instruments unless you know of some objective way to measure it. I guess you can measure honesty in certain ways and dishonesty, but it's a lot harder in general to measure character traits. But there's not really any reason to believe, I think, that different principles would apply if these are character traits people are working towards, if they're end goals that they're eager to achieve. And one of the reasons Angela and I teamed up on and co-founded this institute, the Behavior Change for Good initiative, is that even though we'd been studying pretty different outcome variables in our careers, Angela is particularly really interested in educational outcomes and helping kids, whereas I was studying health outcomes and savings outcomes primarily in adults, we realized that if we could really crack the nut on what are the things that create behavior change, we would expect those principles to apply across domains, because the barriers to change are so similar at all these different levels of observation, regardless of the outcome, regardless of the age group. For the most part, there's just a lot of similarity in what obstructs change and what works to fix it. So theoretically, I would expect the same tools to be useful and applying and applicable to character change and character development. And I know Angela agrees, and she's done some work showing some of these same tools can be useful in those contexts, even though I haven't done that kind of research.
Great. Final question. Are there lessons from your research on personal change that can be applied to systemic change? For something like climate change, should we encourage positive individual changes like recycling, even though they're unlikely to impact the larger problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. You're making me think of a book by Robert Frank from Cornell. I think it's called Under the Influence. I hope I'm getting the title right. It's a wonderful book. And one of the things he talks about is how important for collective action problems it is actually to change individuals' behaviors and attitudes, because there's spillover effects. And once you're recycling more, you're going to start valuing environmental causes more generally, and you may be supportive of different tax structures and so on, and different policy changes. So I do think it's really important because of the way that there are cascades. If we change a single behavior, it often changes not just, oh, I saved more for retirement, or oh, I recycled, but my attitudes generally about the problem that behavior is addressing. So I do think systemic problems can be solved to some should be addressed to some degree with individual behavior change, even if those aren't going to be enough, right? Like if I never use another plastic straw, it's not going to make a dent in the climate crisis, but it's just one way that I am aligning my identity and my values with what's best for the long run.
Great. We usually end with a final question, which is just, what are you hopeful about at this moment? What are you excited about? What are you looking forward to?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm actually hopeful about a lot of things. I'm extra hopeful this morning because of the news about the 5 to 11 vaccine trial results, that I'm finally going to be able to protect my son against COVID to some degree through vaccination. So I'm really optimistic about that. And I'm optimistic that leaders have been moving towards stronger and stronger ways to encourage vaccination in this country. So I'm hopeful about those things. And I'm actually starting to pivot my work away from the sort of crisis research I'd say I've been doing for the last year and a half, trying to tackle issues related to COVID, and back to thinking about behavior change more broadly? What are some of the insights that this crisis has offered that we can apply to other contexts, and getting back to the work that I care about in other domains as well, such as financial outcomes and helping with emergency savings and student outcomes. So I'm feeling really optimistic that the time has come to be able to shift attention back to those issues, and that it's coming soon for all of us, that we're going to be able to return to some degree of normalcy, even though obviously the numbers are pretty abysmal and shocking right now. I do feel like we can see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a delightful conversation, and I want to encourage everyone to pick up the book. It's a fun, fascinating, easy to share read, which would make great cocktail party fodder as well. So
thank you. Thank you so much for hosting me. This was really fun. I enjoyed it.
And so as I wrap up, I just want to note that on October 25th, we are thrilled to welcome Samantha Boardman, psychiatrist and author of Everyday Vitality, who will be talking about human flourishing. So please join us then. And thank you so much again, Katy. It was just
my
great.
pleasure. Thank you.
And congratulations on the vaccine from 5 to 11s.
Thank you. Very excited. Good luck with your twins.
Bye.
Bye-bye.